Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm a medical writer in Amiculum, and I've previously worked as a doctor for many years in the NHS, and also including as a consultant in clinical genetics. And I also have a carer role, so I volunteer with a couple of charities, which I've done for a few years, in various different roles within that, including in research steering groups, writing lay summaries and patient information leaflets, and being involved in research and supporting family care events. So it's an absolute pleasure and a real honour to introduce you, Trishna Bharadia, who's worked for many years, both nationally and internationally, as an inspirational health advocate and patient engagement consultant. So today I'm going to be asking Trishna about the role of patient advocacy in pharma and the how and when of involving patients in drug development. Also, a really important topic, which is diversity and inclusion in patient advocacy initiatives. And then also, hopefully, we'll have a few minutes to look ahead to 2026 and the potential for AI. And then we're really hoping at the end to have some time for some quick fire questions just to get some extra top tips from you. And there's a little bit of a spoiler alert also to hear about your experiences of being in a very well-known and popular TV dance show. So hopefully we'll get around to that too. So a huge welcome, Trishna, and it'd be absolutely great if you could start by introducing yourself and saying a bit more about the wonderful work that you do. And so over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm Trishna Bharadia, and so I've worked in the patient advocacy and the patient engagement space for over 15 years now, and I got into it. So basically, through patient advocacy, it was because of a diagnosis, which a lot of people who go into patient advocacy do get into it because of a diagnosis. I often say that, you don't go to university and learn how to be a patient advocate. That's just not what happens. And so in 2008, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And I actually live with several other chronic health conditions, but it was my diagnosis with MS that, and the experience of that made me want to get into patient advocacy. So I started out volunteering with several different patient groups, initially specifically within MS, but that gradually, what I say, snowballed, and it grew organically into then working in other disease areas, across disease areas. And as I was particularly working more with industry, I started to realize that, and we're talking, over 15 years ago now, at that time, there were some organizations that were working with patients really well, but then there were others where improvements could be made. So that's how I got into patient engagement. So I now have a patient engagement consultancy company, the Spark Global. And I basically work with lots of different stakeholders within healthcare and the medicine's development life cycle to better embed the patient voice into their work. So that's looking at things like patient engagement strategy and the design and delivery of patient-facing projects. It's looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion in healthcare and research. And also, and you mentioned, lay summaries. A particular passion of mine is also patient involvement in health information and scientific publications. So things like patient authorship, plain language summary development. How do we ensure that, all this great scientific information that is out there, how do we ensure that patients are able to access it in an understandable and equitable way? So I work, as I said, with lots of different stakeholders. So that could be medcoms agencies, pharma, digital health companies, clinicians in the NHS, medical publishers, patient groups, you name it. And I'm also a visiting lecturer in patient engagement at the Centre for Pharmaceutical Medicine Research at King's College London University. And amongst all of that, I also wear lots of different hats on various committees and advisory boards. So, for instance, I co-chair the Working with Patients and Communities Forum at the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, which I'm an honorary member of. And that's part of the Royal College of Physicians. So yeah, I do lots of different things and often say that I feel like I found what I was meant to do in life. This is something that I'm incredibly passionate about, hugely interested in, and fell into it, as I said, because of my MS diagnosis.
Thank you so much. You've obviously got an incredible career there, and over many years, and just a wealth of experience, and also obviously really busy. So thank you again for sharing your time with us. And I imagine over 15 years, you've seen a huge amount of change. Maybe maybe not enough change, but or maybe the changes. Well, you'll obviously give us some more insights about the changes you've seen and what you've seen. So that's fascinating. Thank you. Um, so I can guess we can maybe delve straight into our first topic, very general about patient advocacy in pharma. And obviously, there's loads of discussions about what that is. But what do you think patient advocacy should mean to pharma?
So for me, at the very heart of everything pharma does, um, patient advocacy should be there. It should be
Mm,
front and foremost in people's minds. Not just in what I call the traditional function areas, so things like medical affairs, for instance, but in every individual and every function area, everything should always come back to the patient because ultimately that's who pharma is working for. They're working and they're trying to get better outcomes for patients. And so bearing that in mind, it should be recognized as a critical element of the medicine's development life cycle. It's not just a nice to have. It's absolutely crucial in order to develop medicines and treatments that are the most appropriate, the most relevant, the most suitable, and ultimately will be the most accepted by the end users who are the patients. And we should also think about patient advocacy, patient partnerships. We should be thinking about actually that word partnerships. We should be forging partnerships, not having tokenistic engagement. And we need more understanding about essentially so there's a thing out there which is called the ladder of participation. And basically what that does is it gives different levels of participation. And what is the most appropriate for a specific project or activity? When is it most appropriate to involve patients? Who who are the most appropriate patients to engage with and to be working with at any one particular moment or in any one particular project. So I think we need more understanding about that. I think we're starting to get there, and more people are recognizing and organizations are recognizing that co-production, which sits at the top of the ladder of participation, is really the gold standard and what we should be aiming for. Um, I think really patient advocacy should mean that pharma listens, learns, and acts with patients, not for them. It's really about working alongside patients for, joint goals, joint objectives. But I also think that we can't and we shouldn't be ignoring the fact that there's commercial value for patient engagement, for pharma companies to be involving patients in medicines development, because ultimately you're going to get better treatments, better adherence, you're going to get faster and more efficient clinical trials, a more informed patient community. So, shared decision making where patients are increasingly having a say in their treatment and their care choices. So there is a value there as well. And I don't think we should be ignoring that fact. Sometimes I feel like, sometimes it's an issue that's skirted around because it's, oh, should we be talking about this? But actually, no, we should be, because ultimately patient engagement helps make pharma, more efficient and, more profitable in many ways. And ultimately, that's going to be good for patient communities because it means we're going to get, more treatments being developed. We're going to get them faster to patient communities. And that's what patient communities want.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it should be a win-win, shouldn't it, for both pharma and patients? And both in medcoms and pharma, it's very much about we are doing this for patients. But as you say, often the one person or the group that's missing from the room is the patient. So
Yeah.
it's so important, isn't it? And to recognize that and to think about how to improve that. So
And I
yeah,
think also having that understanding that as a stakeholder group, patients per se, they're not just a single homogenous group. So I often talk about the patient voice. And that's very much so that patient voice stakeholder group is made up of patients. And within that, you have different types of patients, but also the caregivers and patient group representatives. That's what makes up the patient voice. And actually, when we're talking about patients as a stakeholder group, each one of those subgroups should also be represented. It's not a case of, okay, let's involve patients and we go out and ask one patient. That's tokenistic. That's not going to bring enough and a sufficient value. We should be seeing it as, okay, how do we engage the patient voice?
so in terms of involving patients early, how how early is early in terms of drug development, would you say?
How early is early?
Yeah,
Early is just never early enough.
yeah.
Um, so as early as setting the research priorities,
Mm, mm,
I will often use the example of multiple sclerosis, where so drug efficacy traditionally in MS has always been tied to walking ability. So the primary endpoints in clinical trials have always been to do with walking ability. But if you actually ask patients what's the most important to them, it's actually lower limb, or whether it's lower limb or upper limb function, it's actually upper limb function. That's what's key to someone's personal independence. Because if they have the use of their arms and their hands, they can dress themselves, eat for themselves, they can, do personal care, like, transferring from, so even if they don't have lower limb function, if they have the ability to use their upper limbs, they can still, for example, transfer from a wheelchair to their bed or into a shower, etc. It's only really recently that upper limb function has started to be seen as a target for disease modifying therapies in MS, and starting to be used as a primary endpoint in clinical trials. And that's actually come about because there was research done. There was a whole campaign called the Think Hand campaign, which was multi-stakeholder and was had an incredibly strong patient voice involved in it. But it begs the question, why has it taken that long to get patients involved in as early as setting the research priorities, helping to determine what the primary endpoints are. So really getting to know what our patient needs. And I think it's not a case of thinking, well, we know what patients' research priorities are, so that's the early stage ticked. We need to then be involving patients in the target product profile, the target value profile development. And that's before we even start thinking about clinical trial design.
mm.
There's actually a great case study in cystic fibrosis with where target product profiles were developed by the Cystic Fibrosis AMR Syndicate. And that was made up of the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, the Medicines Discovery Catapult, and Life Arc. And basically, it resulted in the development of both diagnostic TPPs that provided criteria for new tests that aim to better detect and diagnose CF infections and exacerbations. And it also resulted in the development of therapeutic TPPs. And that was really to steer the development of new I can never say it, antimicrobials to treat lung infections in people with CF. So right at the beginning of that drug development process, patients can be and should be involved, because there's lots of benefits to it. And I think that's not as well understood as necessarily the benefits of getting patients involved at later stages. There's various benefits for patients to be involved in the earlier stages of drug development.
I mean, obviously, it has a huge impact, doesn't it? But it's trying to make that the absolute norm, as you say, rather than needing a full-blown campaign to do it. So, yeah.
No, absolutely.
Mm,
And you know what? And it's actually so it's not complicated.
mhm,
The biggest benefit is that you're going to end up with a medicine that actually meets patient needs,
mm,
because it will meet their research priorities, not just the scientific communities. It will be about what matters most to patients, the daily challenges that they face. And because those might not always be obvious to clinicians or researchers, unless we're involving patients early on, you're not going to know whether you're measuring the right outcomes, whether the drugs are targeting what patients value the most. And then obviously that will then lead into better study design. So it's easier for people to participate, less burdensome. And patients will then hopefully want to participate and want to stay in trials, which then leads to more efficient and faster development. And then you're going to get faster approvals and, medicines quicker to patients. So I think, like I said, I think it's that early stage involvement. The benefits aren't as well known, but it really is about having more equitable, more inclusive treatments. Patients can help to identify barriers that are faced by underserved communities very, very early on, so that you can get a more representative cohort in the trial, and also treatments that work for a broader range of patients. And that, I think, also leads to building trust. I think, trust in pharma, we know, has always been an issue. But if we have that early engagement, you will then have higher trust. You'd have better knowledge of R&D, better transparency. And that means that patients will have more confidence in the drug development process. They'll be more informed about it. They'll, be more informed about their own condition, and then be more empowered to be able to take part in informed decision making once the drug is actually available.
mhm. You touched upon the issue of engaging underrepresented communities, and obviously that's hugely important. How well do we understand the barriers that are in place there? And are there some practical steps that pharma could take to best engage underrepresented communities?
So I think there is a basic level of understanding. I think that as we delve deeper, sometimes it's not understood as well as it should be. And just generally, patient advocacy isn't about getting some voices heard, it's about enabling all voices to be heard. Um, but I think specifically within drug development, we have to remember that the equity, diversity, and inclusion topic It's not just the nice thing to do. It's actually good science, and that's what it comes back to. And that's what was also important for patients as well, because it does make for good science. It is going to make for better treatments for a broader range of people. Um, I think what is still quite misunderstood is, what does diversity and inclusion and representativeness, what does it actually mean for a specific patient group? Often there's a sort of this blanket, let's do EDI, and often it's only about gender and usually race and ethnicity, which, yes, are very important, but we also need to be looking at age, comorbidities, disability, rural versus urban, etc. And so let's just say, okay, let's say, what does representative look like in lung cancer? That's going to be different to what representative looks like in Parkinson's disease, for instance. And that's really where we need a better understanding, so that you are implementing EDI strategies that are specific to your patient community and the patient community that you're working with. But I think also it's about having more equitable and representative patient engagement strategies, and having a more inclusive patient engagement model, and one that favors more equitable patient engagement. So, I'm talking about flexibility, remuneration. It shouldn't just be patients that can afford to, take part if they're being asked to volunteer their time, for instance, which shouldn't be happening if they're working with industry, particularly in countries where you can remunerate patients, but that's a whole other topic. It's also about, education and awareness. It might be that you have to provide support and training for some patients to take part. And if we just go really back to the basics, we need to, like I said, have a clear understanding from the outset. What do we mean by diverse and representative? Even if it means that each specific patient group, we are applying different sort of strategies and different ways of working to take that into consideration. Because if you don't start with the right people in the room, you're not going to have the right people involved throughout. And that includes, when it comes to your actual clinical trial participants. And when we're looking at EDI and patient engagement, we need to be looking at that actually separately from EDI in clinical trials, because that in itself, just the clinical trial process, and we can talk about that in a minute if you like, but just the clinical trial process, that in itself has its own barriers when it comes to diversity and inclusion.
Mm. You make a really interesting and important point that EDI is, we're often fixed with what we think EDI is, but actually it's much, much broader than that. And it's really important to recognize huge number of different patient groups. I might just might come back to you on that point, but just in the interest of time, might just quickly change tack to think about 2026 and AI opportunities. I don't know if you've done much work with AI and what the opportunities and risks are to patients and using AI to benefit them in their clinical and research experiences. I mean, I know there's obviously been those issues when websites first came in. There were similar issues, but AI, I guess, takes it to the next level.
You know what it does, and actually, so I often say that AI is turning into the new Dr. Google. So when Google first sort of came out, and everybody was like, "Oh, I can ask Google this and I can ask Google that," and we were always warned off Dr. Google because it could throw back so many different things, and often it wasn't necessarily giving you the specifics for your particular circumstances. Um, I'm saying it's a bit like the Wild West out there right now when it comes to AI. I'm seeing a lot of appetite from patients wanting to use AI to better understand their experiences, become more informed. But I'm also seeing a disconnect between the concerns that people usually express about their health data privacy, and then they're going and using, open AI models to research their own conditions. I've seen people putting their full clinic letters into ChatGPT, complete with all their personal information and stuff. So I think we really need some education around what is the safe and effective way to use AI in health context, within health context. And also that awareness around the risk of misinformation and, what we know are called hallucinations, which is basically AI making things up, which does happen. So we need to make sure that patients can use AI safely so that they become better informed. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, and actually, I find it really exciting. So, in terms of diagnosis, in terms of patient support, um, accelerating drug development, there's we could do an entire just interview about just AI. But I think for me, the key things are so faster and more accurate diagnosis, and that means people can get onto the right treatments that are specific for them much faster. I think there's a huge amount of potential for more personalized healthcare solutions, whether that's treatment or care pathways, whether it's more personalized information, whether it's just, having a 24/7, chatbot that can help you when you're lying awake at 3 a.m. with, questions which you can't ask your consultant until the morning, and may not be able to get hold of them and may not have a response for a few days. And just to be able to have that more personalized information where you can put in your specific circumstances and possibly get something back that will help better inform you in terms of what you should do next. And then I think it's also the ability to be able for AI to be able to aggregate and interpret a whole load of information, and then put it into language and formats that you can understand. Now, I would say I'm a pretty good researcher, but even I can't do what AI can do in terms of just the sheer volume of information that it can go through in such a quick space of time, and then be able to hone it down to exactly what it is that you're looking for. So I think there's huge opportunities, and I find it very exciting, but I do think there needs to be guardrails there, because just in the same way that I think people generally are becoming much more adept at using, internet search engines in more effective ways, I think we're going to have to go through a similar learning process with AI as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be absolutely fascinating to see where it goes in terms of, for the benefit of patients, but also, as you say, the education is going to be key and making sure everyone's safe in using it. Um, and yeah, maybe there will be an opportunity to have a longer chat with you about it another time. If it's okay with you, we're just going to go to the quick fire questions, sort
Yeah,
of like
sure.
one minute answer type things. And so I'm just going to head straight on in there. So, is there someone or an organization that has particularly inspired you in patient advocacy?
So actually, there's too many to mention individually. So I think honestly, I'm in the best role in the world, surrounded by people who are all championing the patient voice and they're advocating for better healthcare. Every single person at some point will be a patient and or a caregiver. So every individual or organization that is fighting for patients is an inspiration in my book. And I think particularly those that are combining that fight with managing their own health conditions and or caring responsibilities as well. Because you know what? There are times when it's so tough. As an advocate, I feel particularly we experience death and loss much more than the average person because of the area in which we're working. And it's the nature of what we do and who we're surrounded by. And living with health conditions ourselves, that can be really tough. But we don't give up because we know there's always more to do, and that's really what drives me forward.
Oh, that's lovely. That's so inspirational. Thank you. Is there one thing that pharma or medcoms agencies do that you find really annoying with respect to patient advocacy?
So I think there's a few areas where I think work needs to still be done.
Mm,
But I think something that is a huge challenge is so one is the misunderstanding of compliance being a barrier to working with patients when in fact it's an enabler in my books. It's an enabler for fair and transparent patient engagement. So I understand that by nature, pharma can be very conservative when it comes to attitude to risk, but compliance is still being used as an excuse, I think, in many cases, rather than it being an actual reason why something can't be done. And this is because we often get blurring of lines and confusion between what is actually allowed by law and codes of practice compared with what a company policy says. And this has been going on for years, and we really need to move on from it. The other thing, very quickly, which I've mentioned it briefly, is I still don't believe that there is enough recognition that the patient stakeholder group isn't one homogenous group, that it's the patients, it's the caregivers, it's the patient group representatives, and then particularly within that patient subgroup, you have different categories of patients. So you've got your patients by experience, your expert patients, your key opinion leader and thought leader patients. And we need to be looking at how do we effectively work with each of those and in what activities and when, rather than thinking, oh, well, ask a patient and any patient will do. That's just not the case.
mhm. Great. Those are fantastic insights. Thank you. And do you have a top tip for a quick win in patient advocacy that we in a Miculum could implement right now?
So I would say don't wait for clients to say, are we involving patients in this? Medcoms agencies are increasingly recognizing that there is value in engaging directly with patient advocates. That is even outside of client projects. So it's really to help medcoms agencies to steer their strategy, their communications, feed into client proposals, and also partner for things like thought leadership, just like we're doing right now. And I think this shows to clients that you're committed to patient-centered communications. That will then filter into each and every one of your day-to-day work so that making sure that the patient voice is embedded throughout becomes second nature.
Thanks. That's a great top tip and lots of food for thought. And just before we end, we have to ask you about your experience on Strictly Come Dancing. That's amazing you're on that.
You know what? So people always ask me this question. They most
Yeah.
often ask this question right at the very end and then think, oh, actually, if we'd asked it first, we could have filled a whole interview all about Strictly Come Dancing. Yeah, I had the absolutely just brilliant opportunity. I felt so lucky and so privileged to have the opportunity to take part. It was a special 4-part edition of Strictly Come Dancing. It was back in 2015. And it was the only time that they've ever opened the Strictly Come Dancing doors, or Dancing with the Stars, as it's also known in other countries. It was the first time they'd opened it up to non-celebrities, and they were looking for people who had overcome adversity, who'd done lots to help other people, maybe done lots of charity work. Over 11,000 members of the public were nominated. They chose 6 people, and my sister nominated me. I'm a big fan of the show. And I was one of the 6 that was chosen because of my advocacy work and, you know, all the things that I had done since my MS diagnosis. So I got to be partnered with one of the professional dancers. So I was partnered with Aliash Gonianets, who is a big Strictly favourite. And yeah, we had 4 months of filming, dance training. I was dancing the jive with Aliash. We also did a samba-based group dance as well. And it was just the most amazing, surreal, kind of dream come true experience. Not only was it fantastic because obviously I got to learn how to, I got to work with a professional dancer. I got to learn how to dance properly. And just get a glimpse into the world of being a celebrity, which is completely different to obviously my day to day. But it was also an absolutely fantastic opportunity to really raise awareness on probably the biggest platform that we've ever had. So Strictly Come Dancing is probably the biggest family entertainment show that we have in the UK. Only got people talking about MS. And not just and really busting some myths about what living with chronic illness can be like, what living with MS is like, particularly as someone of South Asian heritage. And MS has traditionally been seen as a Caucasian disease. So it was really important for me, particularly, to be raising awareness about the fact that Asians can and do get MS. And it just helped people to start conversations themselves. I was getting messages on social media, people saying that seeing you doing Strictly, it helped me to have a conversation with my family or my friends about their MS or living with another chronic illness. And yeah, it was just an amazing opportunity, which I will never forget it. If I had the chance to do it all again, I would, even though it was absolutely exhausting. And yeah, it was brilliant.
Oh, it sounds absolutely incredible on so many levels. And as you say, things like opening, starting those conversations, absolutely fantastic. Brilliant. Congratulations for being picked and for going on that. And I mean, it just leaves me to say thank you so much for coming to talking with us. It's been fascinating and so interesting. You've given us so much to think about and so many insights, and you are so inspirational. Thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me.